There's a video that was uploaded on YouTube about 2 weeks ago called Redefining Social Justice Warriors, and it is probably the only video that I have seen that has literally, or had literally, zero likes. Um, and I think up to 500 something views, it had zero likes, nothing but dislikes, until, of course, they disabled ratings and comments, as people affiliated with social justice warriors usually tend to do. There's not really much to say about the video. Of course, it's a bunch of buzzwords, a bunch of very vague principles that have absolutely nothing to do with what social justice warriors are, and more importantly, what they actually do. And I'll link it in the description, but the main purpose of this video is to provide a working definition of what a social justice warrior is. For people who might not be familiar with the events of the past few years, and most importantly, the past few months, but also for people who are aware of these things, but are in some situation where they have to define a social justice warrior if they are in a debate with the opposition, who might say, oh, what do you mean by social justice warrior? It's just a buzzword. Okay, so a social justice warrior is, I'd say, someone who does two of these three things. One, someone who has an unwavering belief in what I can only really define as leftist intersexual feminism / critical race theory. There are many different names of this ideology. Some people would just call it feminism. Some people will call it intersectional feminism. Some people will say feminism is too white. Let's call it womanism. And some people might call it critical race theory and reject the feminist and woman, centered aspect of it altogether. But usually it is centered around feminism in some way or another. But the characteristics of this belief are, one, intersectionality. And intersectionality, as defined by bell hooks, who coined the term, is basically the belief that people's identities are made up of these intersectional identities, these identities that kind of cross. For instance, someone who is a LGBT gay black woman, one of their identities is a black woman, and another one of their identities is being a gay woman. And these identities are pretty much entirely defined by how these groups of people are either oppressed or oppressing other people. And, I think bell hooks, one thing I will say about bell hooks is she is very smart in recognizing that these groups can oppress one another. For instance, someone who is black but straight might still have straight privilege and might be oppressing, gay people. But the main point of intersectionality is that people are defined by these identities, which are in turn defined by whether they are oppressors or oppressed. And what follows is a collectivization of victimization and a collectivization of guilt. For instance, if you are a black person, it does not matter that you personally might not have faced institutional racism. You are still a victim of institutional racism just by being a member of this oppressed group. Alternatively, there is a collectivization of guilt. So if you are a white person, it does not matter that you may not have perpetuated racism yourself. You are still a beneficiary of this racism, and that is a construction of privilege. Finally, there is an assertion that things such as racism and sexism can only be done by people who are members of privileged groups and who by definition have the power to inflict said racism and sexism. Now, I'm going to make another video where I totally break down, what I think of this ideology. Needless to say, I do think there is a grain of truth in it, but I think it is an extremely narrow worldview and essentially is a new set of stereotypes, which attempts to put people in boxes based on things they were born into and have no control over. Now, one thing I need to stress is that someone who just believes in this ideology is not necessarily a social justice warrior. From a definition standpoint, the word warrior implies action. So the main characteristics of the definition of a social justice warrior is what they do with this ideology. From a tactical standpoint, I think it is important that people who are opposing social justice warriors are able to separate the radical extremists from this movement from the more moderate people who may believe in a lot of this stuff, but who may not be using it to justify some, reprehensible actions. And so I have some friends who believe in this stuff, but I debate with them quite regularly, and we are still able to maintain our friendships. So I think it's really important that we reserve the term social justice warrior for people who are willing to use this ideology to justify really bad things. So the second aspect of a social justice warrior is someone who is willing to use public shaming and censorship to advance said ideology, and oftentimes on people who only have minor ideological disagreements with them. And I think a great example of this is no platforming, where you had some men's rights activists who were trying to speak in Toronto, and they feminists, of course, pulled the fire alarm on them. And, in some cases, these were people who were far from radical men's rights activists. In some cases, these were people who were feminists who just happened to have minor disagreements with the extreme brand of feminism. And therefore, these social justice warriors determined that these people should not be allowed to speak. And then, of course, we have demanding of resignations and firings over minor disagreements. The best example of this is, of course, the Yale situation, where you had these two professors who simply disagreed with an email telling students to be culturally sensitive with their Halloween costumes. And now these professors were not right-wing, they were not racist, and they weren't neoconservatives. These were left-wing, anti-racist people who just simply did not agree with the fact that the administration should be controlling people's Halloween costumes. But this was enough to garner the social justice mob to demand that they be fired. And, of course, we have doxing, demanding apologies and then refusing to accept them. Just basic nasty tactics and harassment that, you see from a lot of groups, and social justice warriors are not excluded from that. And then finally, using petitions to censor problematic content. The best example of this would be the GTA 5 ban from Target, where a bunch of feminists signed a petition to get Grand Theft Auto 5 pulled from Target because they thought it was promoted violence against women. And so I think the point in which someone crosses over from a believer in social justice to a social justice warrior is when they are willing to employ public shaming and censorship to advance their ideas. Now, the final aspect of a social justice warrior, and, the level that not every social justice warrior is at, but a lot of them are, is when they are willing to break off ties with close friends, significant others, and even family members over these minor ideological disagreements. And this is where you have the term safe space, which is a space in which these people can be surrounded by people who validate their ideology and can keep out people who may disagree with them. And sometimes this can even result in a refusal to even interact with those who do not agree with them. Now, the most troubling aspect of these safe spaces is that there has been a push to expand the borders of these safe spaces to include public spaces, most notably gaming media and gaming in general, and of course universities. And this is at the heart of the events of the last few years, and this is the main reason why there has recently been a pushback against social justice warriors, and it is a reason I myself have found it relevant to speak out against. So this video is pushing 10 minutes already. I think I gave you a pretty good definition of what a social justice warrior is.